Tonight on Talking Politics, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, many parents and caregivers of kids under 5 are feeling left behind and in some cases forgotten. What more could policymakers be doing to help them stay afloat economically and psychologically? We'll dig into that, the future of Boston's employee vaccine mandate, and Governor Baker's final State of the Commonwealth. But first, to the race for Baker's replacement, which gained another contender this week, this time on the Republican side. Businessman and political newcomer Chris Doughty announced his candidacy Wednesday.
I have been on the front lines creating jobs for 3 decades in our state. With the right team, a little creativity, and a willingness to work hard, just about any problem can be solved.
The 59-year-old father of 6 and grandfather and self-described moderate will face Trump-backed former state rep Jeff Deal in the primary. Joining me to talk about this and more are Yawu Miller, senior editor of the Bay State Banner, and Shannon, Jenkins, political scientist and associate dean of UMass Dartmouth's College of Arts and Sciences. Hello to both of you. Shannon, do you think there's an appetite in the GOP right now for a candidate like Chris Doughty?
I think there's an important distinction to be made between the electorate at large and the GOP primary electorate, which are two sort of very different audiences. I certainly think, Charlie Baker's time in office has shown that there's an appetite for that in the general election. And I think we've seen that a little with Maura Healey refusing to criticize Baker, taking the high road on that, trying to position herself in that lane. I'm less certain that there's an appetite for that sort of candidate among GOP primary voters. And so that's going to be the real challenge for Doughty, is that a lot of Republican voters like Trump, and his endorsement of Deal is going to be important to them. And so coming in late, coming in with not a lot of experience, and coming in sort of in the moderate lane is going to make it a steep hill for him to climb in the Republican primary.
Yawu, what's your take on Doughty's prospects?
I mean, Doughty has no political experience, and the fringe of the Republican Party has become the mainstream of the Republican Party, as some political observers like to point out. It's just an uphill battle for him. I think that 10 years ago, his candidacy would have made better sense, but right now he's swimming against the current.
Speaking of Governor Baker, as we have here just a little bit, he gave his final State of the Commonwealth speech this week, and one of the things that he did was issue a call for more civility in politics, something he's done before. Let's take a look how he put it.
I've talked a lot over the past 6 years about collaboration and respect, about seeking common ground, about focusing on the issues and not on the personalities. And I get that it's harder to collaborate and it's harder to show respect in a time of high anxiety and trauma. But I would suggest that it's more important during times like these to ask questions, to be curious, to show empathy, and to maintain an open mind than it is to make brash statements and name call.
Yawu Miller, what else stood out to you about Baker's farewell State of the Commonwealth?
Well, the tax cuts that he's proposing, a lot of them aimed at low-income people and bringing Massachusetts, more in line with federal policy and other states. But at this, so raising the threshold for the no tax status from, I think, $8,000 for a single person to $12,000. Those are pretty progressive policies, but then sort of, you have to balance that with the cuts to the estate, or, the change in the estate tax, where instead of going from $1 million to $2 million to trigger the estate tax, and also a change in the short-term capital gains, a reduction in that tax rate from 12% to 5%. Those together would result in, about $400 million being cut from, state revenue. Republican governors have always had it where, in boom times, they're cutting taxes. And when the economy eventually contracts, those cuts are felt at the department level. This is not as big as what we saw under Weld, Cellucci in the early years of Republican governors, 30-year sort of hold on state government for the most part of the 30 years. But I mean, it still could have an impact down the road when the economy contracts again.
Shannon Jenkins, did anything pop out for you?
The tax cuts obviously stood out to me as well as a very sort of Republican approach to some Democratic ideas, right? Particularly the low income. Instead of spending on programs, right, he's approaching that through a tax framework. It also seemed to be a relatively modest agenda, which is not surprising. He's a lame duck, right? And people are looking to the future. But at the same point in time, he went through his speech, he went through his list of accomplishments. And, some of those are questionable. I think people really would debate him on whether the MBTA is fixed. There's a lot of people who don't agree with him on that. And it feels like his list of accomplishments, when we look back, what has been the signature piece of legislation under Baker, I think a lot of people are going to be hard pressed to say, oh, yes, that was his doing, as opposed to like Romney with healthcare and thinking about education reform. There's not really, for the 8 years in office, a signature policy victory that everyone can point to as being his, shining accomplishment. So it just sort of struck me, he's been a solid governor, but it seemed to be overall a very sort of modest record and modest set of proposals.
I have to mention, and I know that we'll have some viewers watching who are keener on the governor's record than your characterization might have suggested. One of the points that he was at pains to make in this speech is the policing reform legislation that was passed. And he folded that into his narrative of Massachusetts doing politics differently than it's done in some other places and doing politics better. Do you think that's an achievement that might fill that role that you're talking about when people look back and say, what did Governor Baker get done legislatively beyond helping the state weather COVID? Do you think people will cite that?
I mean, I think that's probably one of his biggest ones, but I'm not sure people credit him to that, right? When we talk about healthcare reform, people affectionately or, disparagingly call it Romney care, right? And so it is attached to Governor Romney. Criminal justice reform was a big step forward, but I'm not sure people picture that as Governor Baker's criminal justice reform bill, more driven by the Democrats who brought Baker to the table as they move that forward.
Yawu Miller, let's turn to Boston Mayor Michelle Wu's employee vaccine mandate, which has been delayed by her administration a couple times and now hit another hiccup this week. A judge stayed the implementation of it. I know that we in the political media get accused of oversimplifying things. Having said that, is this a fight that Mayor Wu is losing at this point in time?
Considering that 95% of city employees are now vaccinated, it seems like she's actually winning this. I mean, she's going up against the firefighters and 2 police unions, primarily. That's where the most vociferous, resistance is coming from. And, a small number of protesters. The last one I saw on, on the news, about 4 people showed up. They're making an outsized amount of noise. But for, I think the majority of Massachusetts residents, certainly the majority of Boston residents support these policies. So I think, that with the latest setback notwithstanding, I think she's really winning this.
Shannon Jenkins, would you agree with Yawu's read on the situation?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is about framing, right? And framing it as not, who's not vaccinated, focusing on who is vaccinated is important. And in some ways, the ruling perhaps gives Michelle Wu a little bit of an out, right? Like, what are you going to do if the judge says it's going to move forward? Are you going to fire those 5% of those employees? I'm not sure she would have wanted to go there. And so in some ways, I think she can claim credit for moving the needle up on vaccination rates. And then basically saying, look, my hands are tied. I have to honor this ruling and I can't do that. So in some ways, maybe the ruling helps her out a little bit politically out of a tight spot.
Yawu Miller, the House of Representatives in the legislature took up voting reforms and voting rights this week. They seem ready to embrace some of the changes that were made during the pandemic, but they are not ready yet to embrace same-day registration. They decided to study the issue more, which suggests that it may or may not be acted on years in the future. State Rep Russell Holmes had a pretty cynical reaction to that decision by his colleagues. House leadership made the wrong call on this. This, to me, is protecting incumbency, and I have not heard another argument, and that is antithetical to all of democracy and certainly does not help black and brown people. You think he's onto something there?
I think House leadership has always been focused on protecting incumbency, and Massachusetts has for a long time had one of the lowest, rates of turnover, like the fewest number of challenges. And, successive House speakers have seen it as their mission to preserve incumbency. So, yeah, I mean, when, we've seen in Boston, in the greater Boston area, elections where you've had tremendous turnover, and it's been driven by increased voting by people of color. Looking at Ayanna Pressley, Rachel Rollins. And then also there's another dynamic that's happening here, which is that greater numbers of young people are voting. In the case of Ed Markey, that protected an incumbent, but I think a lot of legislators who may have been elected 10 years ago are looking at these new waves of voters and perhaps seeing it as a threat.
Shannon Jenkins, what does political science research say about the upside of same-day voter registration?
So I think when political scientists look at the effect of election laws, we look at it sort of as voter turnout as having two different components. One being sort of an individual level cost and benefit effect. We can raise the cost of voting or we can lower the cost of voting for any individual. But there's also a mobilization effect, which is a sort of a collective thing, right? And you can think about people wearing their I voted stickers, getting people out to the polls. And so laws can have positive and negative effects on both sides of that equation. And so, for instance, early voting can reduce the cost to individuals to turn out, but it also dilutes the mobilization effect because people are voting on different days. So we know that early voting doesn't tend to move the needle on voter turnout. Same-day registration moves the needle on both of those. It both makes it easier for individuals to participate, and it makes it easier for people to mobilize people. If you show up to someone's door and you knock on their door on election day and there's not registered, there's nothing you can do right now. But if you show up on election day and someone's not registered, you can still bring them to the polls and get them to vote. So same-day registration is really a critical piece of legislation to increase participation in our democracy. The research on that is pretty fundamentally clear. I think I was absolutely right about how that threatens incumbents. When new people come into the electorate, you can't be really sure how they're going to vote. But at the same point in time, as a political scientist, I find it disappointing because this is really a law that has positive impacts on both those aspects of the voting process.
All right, Shannon Jenkins and Yawu Miller, thank you for that convo. It's been more than 13 months since the first COVID vaccine was administered in the U.S. outside of trials, more than 9 months since adults across the board in Massachusetts became eligible to get a shot. And as of this week, 87% of people in the state have gotten at least one vaccine dose. It's a number to celebrate, but also a number many point to declare this is now a pandemic of the unvaccinated, a turn of phrase that implies a choice in that status. But for kids under 5, getting vaccinated still is not an option. And for their parents and caregivers, the pandemic can feel like it's still stuck in neutral. They're weighing infection risks against developmental needs and hoping to get through a full week with childcare intact and without having to quarantine. The accumulated stress led one local mom with young kids to gather fellow parents into a field recently for a so-called primal scream, which attracted plenty of media attention and inspired similar events nationwide, showcasing the collective anger and exhaustion felt by so many. So is all of this inevitable, or could policymakers be doing more? Joining me are GBH News reporter Craig LeMoult and Gladys Vega, Executive Director of Chelsea's La Colaborativa. Thank you both for being here. Gladys, let me start with you. I got a rundown of what the state has done recently to try to ease the burden on parents and caregivers. And there are some big things. Financial relief provided to daycare providers, financial relief also provided to lower income parents, for example. To your mind, what are the biggest things the state could be doing right now to make things better?
So remember that although the state has done a lot we still have approximately 29,000 children that are excluded because their parents' undocumented status. So imagine, that child tax credit doesn't apply for them. I think that we still need to work on policies that would address the issues every children in the United States. I think that that for Chelsea families, the burden remains not being able to fully go back to work, not having access to childcare, not having children being fully vaccinated because the lack of trust of something so new. So I think all those things play a huge role as we think of creating policies that address the needs of a family in communities like Chelsea.
You and I talked just briefly before this show, and one of the things you mentioned to me was that the state, as you see it, could be making it easier for people to become childcare providers, right? Why would that be valuable, do you think?
So I think it's extremely valuable because if a mom is able to not find a job and she's able to get the skills from the Department of Early Education so that they can get the license to start a child care process, a home child care, why not, and make it available. That way they can, if they have a small children, they can stay home. It's also very, very pricey. Child care is extremely pricey when you go private. I remember my daughter was paying $350 for 3 days a week. And it wasn't like, it wasn't like he was in a Montessori school, but it was that amount of money. So, I mean, if you are a parent and you need to choose between quality daycare and paying the rent, of course, the daycare will be out of the question, and you may have to leave as a younger sibling behind doing the child care.
Whereas if you can find child care, then you can be comfortable about the kid, your child getting good care, and you can go back to work and make money for your family.
Exactly.
Let me bring in, hold these thoughts. Let me bring in Craig LeMoult, who I know has a young child in a daycare or a child care setting right now. You guys recently experienced firsthand the chaos that COVID can create at this particular moment in time for people like you. What happened to your family, Craig?
Yeah, and I think what happened to us is in no way unusual. And we made it through, certainly. But two things. First of all, a child in my child's daycare class tested positive for COVID, which I think is just happening basically all over the state right now. And he was home for basically about a week as and then needed to get a PCR test that came back negative before he could return to school. So, for us, we're working parents, and that was a bit of a challenge. And we were able to get by. We were able to take some days off and to balance some things. But this is really a challenge, especially for a lot of people who are lower income and don't have the ability to just take a day off. Also, the week after the holidays, the entire daycare program shut down because they didn't have enough teachers who were able to come in to care for the students. And, they were either COVID positive themselves or they had someone in their family who was. And the daycare program just said, that's it. We can't open for this week. Thankfully, it opened up the next week. But I just, talked to somebody at the State Association for Early Childhood Education and Care who mentioned a program in Worcester that has 13 of 15 classes currently closed down because they just don't have the teachers or because of positive tests in classes.
I know the state is about to roll out a change in the way testing is done in daycare settings. What exactly is going to be changing when that happens, either later this month or early February?
Yeah, as of Monday, they're supposed to be rolling out this program. And it's important to note that this is entirely optional for daycares because unlike the K-12 system, this is not a public system of schools. These are, thousands of private businesses who have an option to do something or not do it if they want to. But there's three levels to the testing. One actually has been in place since June, which is pool testing. I personally didn't realize that this was even available to daycare since June, but they have had free pool testing available to them in that time. And what's being added as of Monday is rapid antigen tests are being made available. And that'll be done in one of two different ways. One is what they call cohort testing, which is like, for example, when a child in my kid's class tested positive, the other parents can have their kids tested using rapid antigen tests. And if they test negative, they can continue to go in. He wouldn't have to stay home with us like he did that time. That could either be done by the parents at home, or the daycare center could choose to do it themselves. And in addition to the cohort testing, there's also symptomatic testing. So if a kid in daycare, has a sniffle, which we know kids in daycare,
every single kid in daycare has, right.
Yeah. One of the people in the daycare could give a rapid antigen test to that kid, or send one home for the parent to do it. I talked to daycares about this, and I think there's a real difference of opinion about whether or not they're even going to do this, how much of the program they're going to take part in. It's really resource intensive. It's a lot for the daycares to train their staff and to make sure that this is done properly. With the pool testing, it's 3 and above, age 3 and above. Under age 3, it has to be done by a nurse. So you'd have to have an in-staff nurse to actually do that kind of thing.
That's the sort of complexity that doesn't even occur to me when I think about a program like this. Gladys, Vega, the point you were making when I brought Craig in a moment ago was the incredibly high cost of childcare. And I remember that from when my kids were that age. It can be brutal. You co-wrote a piece for the Bay State Banner a little while ago, urging state legislators and policymakers to expand the child care tax credit at the state level. Did they act on your request?
So they acted in different parts of the request. It's not fully what we asked for. It's better, but not every child of the families that we serve are able to participate. Many of them are excluded in the process. That is why La Colaborativa, from the families that we serve, we heard it over and over again, that in order for them to sort of like get off unemployment benefits or go back to fully work, they need childcare. So we are trying to put together this childcare co-op that allows for our families to create their own childcare license services so that they're able to do childcare from home. We were forced to think creatively on that because we know that at times a lot of parents cannot able to maintain their childcare because at times if someone gets COVID, all the kids get their daycare may get closed down, or if someone gets COVID at work, she may be sent home and the woman who's taking care of them says, you know what, you're not giving me consistency. I cannot keep my childcare open. So we're trying our best to be extremely creative about also childcare that may have an opportunity where you drop a kid and it doesn't have to be the regular kid all the time. That way there's a one day drop off. It may be Carmen, the other one may be little Gloria who needs the daycare, but being very creative about how we think about childcare, just because we need to figure out what to do with the services that are not fully provided, especially if we're trying to integrate the community back to work, if we're trying to provide trainings and make sure that our community is able to sustain. Remember, there's a lot of services that were put together during the pandemic. All those services soon will be gone, and it leaves behind a community that is extremely poor and a community with lots of unknowns due to the fact that you never know when you have a new variant that will allow for us to take another step back.
Yeah.
So I think that we're thinking creatively on how do we handle the 29,000 children that have been excluded from not receiving the tax break.
Craig LeMoult, as Gladys was just saying, there is an opportunity at the state level to provide financial relief. There's an opportunity at the federal level, but the Build Back Better package that President Biden wanted to get passed seems to be stuck, pretty much going nowhere in Washington. You are doing some reporting right now in Lawrence, where they're doing some creative things municipally. What are they doing exactly in Lawrence?
Yeah, it is an interesting thing. And as you said, Build Back Better essentially is on hold the very least, Catherine Clark, Congresswoman Catherine Clark, was talking to people just yesterday in the business community, saying that she was optimistic that this was actually going to get over the finish line. You know, they're breaking it up into the component parts. But at the state level and on the municipal level, there are other attempts at doing this. And in Lawrence, they have expanded the voucher program. So in the state, there is a voucher program that is available to low-income people to help them qualify and pay for childcare. But it's not, you know, it's not available to a lot of people. Right now, if a single parent who makes $45,000 a year does not qualify for this state subsidy for daycare, even though for an infant, it can cost $21,000 a year just to pay for that care. So it's you know, really not available to a lot of people. And what they're doing in Lawrence is they're expanding who's essentially available for that. You know, they used federal grants and they're using the city budget to pay for childcare for more families. So they've made it so that anybody who falls below 50% of median income, state median income, qualifies for a voucher. And anybody else can get it if how much it would cost them, it goes up to 8% of their income. That's a big issue, right?
I was fascinated by this because I think of it as something that cities and towns don't have control over, but obviously that's not the case. We only have about 45 seconds left. I want to ask each of you very quickly, a bunch of physicians, about 250, signed a letter recently urging the federal government to move quicker when it comes to getting vaccines to younger children. Briefly, about 10 seconds each of you. Gladys, Vega, is there an appetite in Chelsea and among the people you serve to get really young kids vaccinated when it becomes available? And then I'd like to hear from Craig.
Yes, there is. Send them to us and we'll make it happen.
Okay, excellent. And Craig, would you have any hesitation about getting your younger kid the vax when they can?
When the federal government says that it is safe and they're opening it up, absolutely not. I would be thrilled, and I feel like he's vulnerable now, and that would protect him.
All right, Craig LeMoult and Gladys Vega, thank you both. Really appreciate it. That's it for tonight, but do come back next week, and please tell us what you think. Keep sending your story ideas and feedback our way. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics, or you can find me on Twitter @ReillyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.